Hello, I'm Dr. Ben Miller. I'm an epidemiologist, and I've been asked to talk to you at Sauer about the COVID-19 vaccines and provide a little background information on what the vaccines are and why it's important to consider being vaccinated. As part of this presentation, we'll look a little bit about why do we care about being vaccinated for COVID-19, talk somewhat about the vaccine basics, answer some common questions, and speak about, say, the safety and efficacy of these vaccines, and also think a little bit about what the new normal will look like in the coming months. So why do we care about COVID-19 and being vaccinated? Recent studies have shown us that a significant number of people have died because of the pandemic, probably about 10 times more than we would normally see with influenza over a given year. So we know that the excess mortality or excess deaths caused by COVID have been a significant problem. And vaccines are one way to protect everyone in a community against the spread of what still is a contagious virus. Let's talk a little bit about vaccines and how they work. Vaccines contain part of the virus that the virus that causes disease, but a vaccine itself won't actually cause you to get sick. It shows the body a portion of that virus and allows the body to start to create an immune response so that if it sees that virus again in the future, it can quickly react and stop infection. And the vaccines that we have here in the United States are very effective at doing that. As you think about being vaccinated, what are the benefits to you as a person? Well, first, the vaccine helps prevent anyone from developing severe illness, hospitalization, or ultimately dying of infection. What we have seen is these vaccines are quite safe and very effective at preventing severe illness. And they also help protect your friends and family as well. We're learning more that these vaccines actually prevent infection and transmission, even of mild illness. So in order to help end the pandemic and return to our normal way of living, these vaccines are an important tool in getting us to that point. And the more people who we ultimately get vaccinated, the faster we can all get back to normal. There are also benefits as well in terms of mask usage and who needs to wear a mask in which particular settings. The CDC has made recommendations that say that people who are fully vaccinated no longer need to wear masks outdoors. The other piece of information is if you're fully vaccinated and come into close contact with someone who is infectious with COVID, you don't need to quarantine. So there are some immediate benefits to those people who are fully vaccinated. When we look at the community, we're trying to achieve a level of protection overall in the United States that gets us to a point that we often heard talked about as herd immunity. And that happens when enough people have been vaccinated within the population that we really reduce the risk of spread in the total population overall. Current estimates place herd immunity at occurring around 70 to 85 or 90% of the population being fully vaccinated. Currently, we're at about 50% that have received at least one dose of the vaccine. So we're on a good path to get there, but we'll need more people to be comfortable being vaccinated and understand the benefits to them and the broader community to get back to true normal. When we talk about vaccines, there's several types of vaccines that are being used here in the United States right now. Some parts of the world use a whole virus vaccine. We're not using those in the United States. Those are vaccines that have, or those are viruses that have been inactivated so that they can't cause infection, but essentially show the entire virus to the body to trigger the immune response. In the US, we're using newer technology that uses what are called mRNA vaccines to cause, to show the body of the person being vaccinated a small piece of genetic material that allows the body to trigger an immune response. We're also using what are called viral vector vaccines that use a different kind of virus to deliver some genetic material into the human cell and also start to trigger that immune response. And we'll talk about both of those vaccines here shortly. We also talk about vaccine efficacy, and it's important to understand how that's measured. So when these vaccines were being studied, they go through what are called phase 3 clinical trials, where we vaccinate a large group of people with the actual vaccine, and we vaccinate a same size group of people with a placebo, usually just salt water. And we compare what happens to those two groups over time. And so when we compared the placebo to the vaccinated group, and this slide shows us the data for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, we found that 66% fewer cases of COVID in the vaccinated group. And more importantly, 85% fewer cases of severe illness in the vaccinated group. Those are good numbers. Typically with like an influenza vaccine, we see about 40 to 60% efficacy. So these are good vaccines. For the mRNA vaccines, the efficacy is even higher, 80 or 90%, preventing symptomatic illness. So we have good tools with these vaccines, and we do know that they're safe. So for the phase 3 clinical trials for the mRNA vaccines, and this is a graphic that shows how these vaccines work, Pfizer studied their population at about 44,000 people, and initial data showed that those vaccines, the Pfizer vaccines, about 95% effective. And that vaccine can be used in those 16 and older. Moderna, which is another mRNA vaccine that's available here in the United States, studied their vaccine in a population of about 30,000 people and found it to be about 94% effective, so still very good. That vaccine's approved in those 18 and older. This graphic shows us how these vaccines work in a simplified way. So this red helical shape here is RNA, and that's a little bit of viral genetic material that codes for a surface protein on the virus, and that is how the virus gets into your cell. And so what these vaccines do is they actually have the human cell manufacture that viral surface protein to trigger the immune response. It's important to know that these vaccines won't cause you to get COVID-19, and they also don't affect your DNA, but they do use some of the structures in the human cell to produce these spike proteins that trigger the immune response. So in this case, a small bit of viral RNA enters your cell, and it's coded into an amino acid inside the cell, which is done by ribosomes. Most human cells have ribosomes in them. You're coding proteins every day, all the time. These vaccines use that same cellular mechanics to make these surface proteins that then migrate to the surface of the human cell, where your immune system recognizes it as something it hasn't seen before. That triggers an immune response, and your body starts to develop antibodies, and in the long term, what are called T and B cells that remember that you've seen that surface protein in the past. So if you're to actually be exposed to the virus in the real world, your body can quickly recognize it and mount an immune response. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine works in a similar way, except in this case, it uses another virus that actually doesn't cause human illness to bring some DNA into your cell. That DNA gets uncoiled or unraveled into the viral RNA, and then it goes through the same process as the mRNA vaccines. So both of these platforms, the mRNA or adenovirus platforms, work in similar ways, and they both are quite effective. For the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, there have been very rare instances of blood clots associated with that vaccine. FDA and CDC here in the United States reviewed that data and made the determination that these are still very safe and effective vaccines. We do know that those blood clots tend to occur mostly in women under the age of 50. So that's something to consider about when you're deciding which vaccine you would like to receive. Now, one question that's asked and that's important is, are these vaccines safe? So at this point, we've administered over 100 million doses of vaccine here in the US. And aside from the blood clot issue that we've seen with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, we haven't seen any similar issues with the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine. So again, over half of the US population has received a single dose. What that tells us is that these vaccines are quite safe. We have robust monitoring systems in place for people to report any side effects that they might experience with these vaccines. And we haven't seen any significant side effects, especially associated with the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine. What are some common side effects that someone might experience after they receive either the first or second dose of the vaccine? And both the Pfizer and the Moderna are 2-dose vaccines. The Johnson & Johnson is a single-dose vaccine. We do know that most people will experience some soreness where you actually get the shot, followed by fatigue, headache, some muscle aches, chills, fever. Those are common side effects that usually occur within 12 to 24 hours after receiving either the first dose or the second dose. We also see that women and younger people tend to experience a little more side effects after that second dose. So when you're receiving your second dose, maybe plan to take the day off or take it easy the next day because you may experience some side effects. Now, what are some common questions about the vaccines? One is that these were developed very quickly. So how do we know if these will be safe in the long run? The good news is we've been making vaccines for decades, and we have good safety systems in place to monitor side effects associated with vaccines. As I said before, we've administered over 100 million doses of these vaccines here in the United States, and we haven't seen any evidence of really significant side effects. That's the good news. At this point, we would expect to see something if it were going to occur, especially giving that many doses. The next question is, how long will these vaccines work? That's a question that we're going to have to monitor and check the science on. We know that they work as long as they've been around so far and that they've been effective, so at least 6 months. Research on other types of coronaviruses suggests that these vaccines may last 2 to 5 years or even longer. So we do expect that what we call durability of these vaccines will be good over time. Another question is, do these vaccines change or interact with my DNA? And they don't. If we think back to those graphics that we looked at in terms of how they look, they do use some of the mechanics that are in your human cell to make amino acids and proteins, but they don't actually interact with your human DNA in any way. So is it safer just to get COVID and be protected that way? The answer to that is no. When we look at how safe these vaccines are and how effective they are, it's much safer to receive the vaccine than it is to contract COVID. We still know that many people, even young people, can develop severe illness associated with COVID and that requires hospitalization or can even lead to mortality. The good news is we haven't seen a single case of mortality in someone who has been vaccinated, even in the elderly. So we know that these vaccines are very good at preventing hospitalization and death, and therefore to be vaccinated is much safer than contracting COVID to gain immunity that way. Another question that often comes up is, when can children be vaccinated? We expect that children aged 12 to 15 should be able to receive the vaccine probably starting in May of 2021. And vaccines should be available to those 12 and under starting this fall or closer to the end of 2021. So as children start to go back to school, we do expect to see this vaccine made available to them. Another question that comes up is, how will the new variants affect the vaccines? So in different parts of the world, we're seeing new variants emerge, and this is an important area of research. We do know that some of these vaccines are less effective against the new variants. This is something that the vaccine manufacturers will be monitoring, and it's likely that we'll have updated vaccines with boosters to protect against some of these new variants in about a year or thereabouts. So it's likely that people will be able to receive booster shots for these vaccines sometime in the spring of 2022. So just to summarize what we've talked about, the vaccines are very good at reducing severe illness associated with COVID-19. Again, hundreds of millions of doses have been administered here in the US, and we do have really good safety data that shows that there aren't significant side effects associated with these vaccines. We also have research that shows that these vaccines prevent transmission. This is important because it will help us get back to normal more quickly with more people vaccinated by achieving herd immunity. So if we can get to about 70, 75, 80% of the population vaccinated, we should really see a dramatic decrease in the number of cases of illness, probably starting midsummer of 2021. And we do know that the impact of some of these new variants will require booster shots probably again in spring of 2022. So what does the future look like? More research is being done, as I've mentioned. If case rates continue to decrease and if vaccination rates continue to increase, we should start to see things return to normal by mid to late summer, and we'll really start to see a dialing back of some of those requirements that we've had in place in terms of physical distancing and mask usage. That will really depend on the rate of vaccination in your community or your place of employment. So the more people who are vaccinated where you work, the more quickly we can get back to something that feels a lot more normal. And in summary, these vaccines are effective. They reduce the risk of severe illness. It is important to continue with some of the controls that we have in place until a large enough portion of the population is vaccinated, until we get to that herd immunity point. So even as more people are being vaccinated, we're still keeping some of those control measures in place, like physical distancing and mask usage. Again, those things should start to loosen up probably by late summer, as long as we get enough people in the US vaccinated. I appreciate your time. Hopefully this was an informative presentation, and I wish you well in your decision to be vaccinated. Have a great day.